Renaissance style, and as a result acquired some of its most impressive buildings. But they did not impress John Ruskin.
Ruskin despised the Renaissance architecture of Venice. He considered it to be a symptom of the city's decline and fall. The classical columns, the pediments, the sheer symmetries seemed to him to be alien to the life and spirit of the place. What had Venice to do with classical antiquity? What had Venice to do with the austerity, the purity, the massive uniformity at the heart of the Renaissance style?
The great exponents of the Renaissance style, Carducci, Sansovino, and Palladio, were not themselves Venetian. They cast a foreign eye over the city. Palladio did not even like traditional Venetian architecture, believing it to lack grazia and bellezza. Yet their achievement was such that Renaissance architecture became the foundation of the public or bureaucratic city. It also became an extreme version of its sacred architecture, with Palladio's San Giorgio Maggiore and Il Redentore.
It has been said that the edifices of Palladio do not suit Venice. They do not fit Venice. But in Venice, everything fits. It's such a mixed and eclectic culture, so full of styles and traditions, so full of borrowings and adaptations, that it's acquired an aesthetic of its own.
If the various styles of architecture represented the spirit of the place as a distinctive and recognizable genius loci, that may be because all of them rose directly from the same foundations. The building of Venice was an act of communal perseverance against nature. Venice rests upon a petrified forest. Somehow it manages both to defy and to make use of nature. Great trunks of oak and larch and elm had always to be submerged. If they were exposed to the air, they would begin to rot. The weight they bore was immense.
The Campanile in St. Mark's Square weighs 14,400 tons, yet the piles of wood carry it. The bridge over the Rialto is supported by 12,000 piles of elm. The Church of La Salute is borne up by 1,156,657 piles of oak and larch. The weight of the building itself helps to stabilize them.
It is not so much that Venice is sinking, but that the waters of the lagoon are rising. We may concentrate upon the great flood of 1966, when the water rose 2 meters above normal, but the city is still being flooded 60 times a year. There will always be work for the charities set up to save Venice from itself.
The events of 1966 must have caused enormous shock to the Venetian people.
It was a shock because it was so particularly high, but they are used, or were used to having very regular flooding. And this one was 1 meter, 94 centimeters above mean sea level, so it was exceptional. And also it stayed up longer than usual. It stayed up for 2 days, 48 hours before it went down at all.
And it must have aroused fears in people about the very survival of Venice as a city.
Certainly, yes. It was also very notable in Florence, where the Arno flooded very quickly and created enormous damage in Florence, in Santa Croce. There was very historic photographs of the church being flooded. And so our attention was drawn to this by the Italian government appealing to UNESCO, saying the world must come and help us. Florence was much more important at that time. So our first fund, which was formed in November, and the flood occurred on November the 4th, 1966, was called the Italian Art and Archives Rescue Fund, because in Florence the archives were particularly important. The archives of the state archives went underwater. 2 years later, they said, the Florentines said, we can manage, we're all right. And so, at that point, the superintendent for fine arts here in Venice, Dr. Balcanova, came down to see us in Florence and said, please, we need your help in Venice. So we changed the name from Italian Art and Archives to the Venice Peril Fund. This is the church of San Niccolò dei Mendicanti, in a part of Venice which is very poor but very much devoted to the cult of St. Nicholas, our patron saint of Christmas, on December the 6th. The first thing was to take up the floor, which is wonderful squares of Verona red and cream marble, and damp-proof it with a system of laying a bitumen level. Then we also financed the restoration of the wooden statues which are all around, and particularly the seated statue of St. Nicholas on the high altar. We also had the organ restored, because that's a very important part of it. It's got a wonderful organ, sort of early organ, about 1740, I think. Well, it took us a good 4 years. It was a big job.
So you've preserved part of the living Venice?
This is what we hope to have done, yes. It's not just a question of restoring buildings which are going to be just monumental museum-like, but it is keeping people here as much as possible. From the very beginning, the government took on the responsibility for a plan for flood control, because as you know there are 3 entrances to the lagoon, and that has been financed by the Ministry for Public Works, and it should be finished in 2014 now. It's been a long process, and to some extent contested by the local council, who felt that too much money was being spent on these great hydraulic controls rather than on the city, but they're absolutely essential, there's no doubt, and so it shouldn't happen again unless the tide were to really do something astronomical, over 2 meters high. Of course, one doesn't know with climate change just what could occur in the upper Adriatic.
In the 21st century, the restoration of Venice is undertaken with infinite care, but 150 years earlier, the contemporary restoration of many buildings in Venice was a case history of seeming rather than being. After the fall of the Venetian Republic at the hands of Napoleon in 1789, the city lost its authority in the world. Its economy was eclipsed, along with its power. Over the past 2 centuries, it has attempted to create a phantom of its glorious past. In their devotion to appearances, the restorers created an unreal city, bearing little relation to its past or to its present. The architects and designers were concerned to reprise the aesthetic contours of the city, but these were imagined rather than real, the fruit of wishful thinking and of nostalgia.
What happened in practice is that they modified or remodeled the architectural language of the past in order to conform to their idea of what Venice really ought to look like. Fluting and veneer were removed, horizontal lines were straightened and strengthened, windows were taken out to conform to the structure. The balconies were narrowed for the sake of overall harmony. Attics were taken out, and Baroque fixtures were replaced by Gothic fixtures.
For some reason, the stronger shades of red and yellow have spread in a city where they did not exist before. The style was known as ripristino. It amounted to the creation of fakes. It is an example of a general malaise of modern Venice, first recognized by the German sociologist George Simmel in the early part of the 20th century. He remarked that the city represented the tragedy of a surface that has been left by its foundation.
It's very bad to me what history has deposited on the city, on us, wrinkles and things like that as well. It's the beauty of the person, it's the beauty of the city. Anna Magnani said to the lady who was putting some makeup to her before shooting a film, she said, "Don't remove a single wrinkle from my face, because they costed me a lot." That's the same for the city of Venice. When I enter in a house or in a palace or in a church that needs some restoration and was kept empty for a certain period of time, is the smell. The smell of the history. You can call it even perfume, but there is a particular smell which inebriates me in a way and expresses the smell of the old plaster, the smell of humidity on the stones and bricks, the smell of the wood, of the beams, of the trusses. I try to travel quite a lot, and when I come back to Venice, every time is an immense pleasure.
The population of historic Venice has shrunk to about 60,000 souls. Many are pessimistic about the future of its people and of its buildings. But there is a new generation that holds a different view. Toto Bergamo Rossi has sensitively restored the Palazzo Gradenigo on the Rio Marin and is involved with a new organization called Venetian Heritage.
As you can see from the foundation of the house, and you know, they have a lot of movement, like here. Nothing is really straight in Venice. Nothing is horizontal or perfectly vertical. It's all about, especially the wall inside the house. They don't have the same quality of foundation on the canal, and the one inside normally they always collapse at 2 meters distance from the facade, and this is why everything is irregular: floor, doors, ceiling. But thank God I never demolished the ceiling, so I was able to discover this, and it's quite, you know, a good 18th century school of Tiepolo. I think it's a good result.
Why do you think Gothic is the natural style of Venice?
Venice was already very well protected from attack of wars or whatever, so it's the only city you have a Gothic style, but open like in a Byzantine loggia, in a Byzantine way, and not only because of the sea, of the water, but because the city was very safe. So this is why, you know, you have this kind of huge loggias and windows in the Grand Canal and in the Little Canal, because the city was very safe. It's not like a Gothic palace in Florence. It's have narrow windows and everything very close. And the Venetian Gothic, you can recognize for frame and Eastern stone, the stone we bring from the Dalmatian coast, and bricks. So they have that kind of 2 colors, white and red pink. It's like a mission, you know, because I am born here and I feel like part of, and so it's something like a responsibility to take care about some old women with disease, like Venice for me it is. It's an old, beautiful actress, let's say, but you know, like always that kind of person, they need help, they need to be cured.
I don't think there's anything more powerful in life than trying to preserve and explore the city or place in which you were born. It's a very powerful imperative in human beings.
I don't know, I always have that feeling about, let's try to do something. Some days I say to myself, let's get away and disappear in some modern, normal place, because Venice is not easy to live full time in Venice. But you know, when you have that kind of beauty around, you can say, you can't see, you know, you can't see. First is a passion, and after it's also my job, but it's right to say it's about passion.
The malaise of Venice, which Toto Rossi fights against, may in part be explained by the fact that its architecture is associated with death and pestilence.
It is in large part a dilapidated city, its waters lapping against crumbling brick and plaster. John Addington Symonds, in a Venetian medley, records that the blackness of the water whispers in our ears a tale of death. It is a city of shadows.
There is now an island of the dead close to the city. It is an architectural wonder. San Michele once sustained a monastery devoted to learning, but in the 19th century a cemetery was constructed here so that the cadavers would no longer be close to the living population of Venice. The bodies are placed in little marble drawers like an enormous sideboard of mortality. The church of San Michele, built some 4 centuries earlier, is like a whitened sepulchre guarding the site. Its recumbent corpses outnumber by many times the inhabitants of the city.
Wagner died in Venice. Stravinsky died in a thunderstorm. Browning died here too. And so did Diaghilev, who is buried over there in the cemetery. Some people died here by proxy. Dante expired of a fever in Ravenna, but one contracted in Venice.
Byron had decided to end his days in the city, but events elsewhere overtook him. It is presumably a matter of statistical probability that a certain amount of artists would die in this most artistic of cities. But the truth is that many people came to Venice precisely in order to die.
For Henry James, the 19th century American novelist, Venice was the most beautiful tomb in the world, where the past was laid to rest with such tenderness, such a sadness of resignation. The churches were filled with graves, and the grandiloquent tombs of Venice are some of that city's most splendid memorials. The wall tombs are unique in Italy.
From the 13th century onwards, the sculptors of Venice devoted their best efforts to the creation of funerary monuments. Yet the cemetery may also become a metaphor. In the 18th century, Venice was described as a tomb of noblemen in which healthy people are locked up. The perpetual sound of bells is a rehearsal for death. I do not feel any romance in Venice, Ruskin told his father. It is simply a heap of ruins. In the 19th century, in fact, Venice seemed to be at its last gasp. The palaces were abandoned or had been turned into warrens of tenements. The people were impoverished. The canals were stagnant and blocked with weeds. The great houses along the Grand Canal were mouldering. There are, of course, no ruins of the classical past. Almost alone among Italian cities, Venice has no such relics, but rather the slow and continuing decay of a still to be apprehended beauty. The city does not have the security of great and primary